Hello, and welcome to this CAGE event to discuss the role of cities in tackling regional inequality. My name is Gemma Tetlow, and I'm Chief Economist at the Institute for Government and a member of CAGE's advisory board, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's event. This event marks the launch of CAGE's new policy report, which looks at economic challenges and success in the post-COVID era, including looking at what impact the pandemic has had on the UK's regional economic geography. Levelling up was one of the key pledges of the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto, and Boris Johnson's made clear that he wants to make it his big priority now that the threat of the pandemic is starting to wane. There are lots of aspects that are talked about as levelling up, from safer neighbourhoods to improving civic pride, but one key aspect of it does seem to be boosting the economic performance of parts of the UK that have traditionally lagged behind. This is undoubtedly a noble aim, but this certainly isn't the first government to think about trying to tackle this. The previous Labour government had its regional development agencies, George Osborne had his Northern Powerhouse, and Theresa May had the Midlands Engine. But none of these policies have so far really tackled the economic dominance of London and the South East. This is in spite of the fact, and so far, as the new CAGE research shows, the pandemic also doesn't seem to have really broken the lure of London and the South East. This is in spite of the fact that Londoners' wages have been stagnant and that their disposable incomes are being eroded by rising house prices. So what can the government do differently this time? Today we have three expert panelists to help us chew over these issues and think about what works. We have Mirko, who is Professor of Economics at Warwick and Director of CAGE. We have Rebecca Riley, who is the Head of Research at West Midlands Combined Authority, and Paul Swinney, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. Our focus today is on the role of cities specifically. And so far, the government has actually blown rather hot and cold on the role of cities. In the Treasury's Plan for Growth, published in March, that describes cities as the engine of growth for their regions. And the research from CAGE shows that people actually like living in and around cities. But Boris Johnson has been heard to lament the brain drain from towns to cities. And Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has said that at the heart of levelling up is the idea that people shouldn't have to move from towns into cities. So I'm really pleased that today we can focus on this question of what role cities can and should play in promoting regional economic growth. Today's event is going to be broken down into three parts. At the start of each part, we're going to ask one of the panelists to give some opening remarks. We'll then have some wider discussion with the rest of the panel and take questions from you. So please do start sending in your questions by going to slido.com and typing in the number 509366, or by clicking in the link in the event descriptors. If you see a question that's already been asked that's similar to what you wanted to ask, please do like that so that we know it's popular. And please do add your name and where you're tuning in from if you're happy to, because it's always interesting to know who we're talking to. A few other brief housekeeping notes before we start. We will be live tweeting this event from the account @CAGE_Warwick using the hashtag Cities Still Matter. So please do follow and tweet along. Today's event is on the record, and a video of the recording will be available on CAGE's YouTube channel within 24 hours, or if you've signed up for this event, then we'll send it to you directly. So without further ado then, let's come to you first, Paul, for our first question. What do you think? Can regions really tackle the economic dominance of London?
The short answer to that, with the right policy interventions, is yes, but there are two more detailed things to consider within this. So the first is in terms of what's the best bet within the regions in terms of how they're going to catch up. Well, actually, it's about trying to boost the performance of their biggest cities. So places like Birmingham, like Manchester, like Glasgow. And if you look at productivity, what we think is ultimately the key measure of trying to close gaps in terms of levelling up is improving productivity. We see that Manchester lags way behind places like Munich and like Stuttgart and other large Western European cities. And what we see is that it's not pulling its weight, and it's not, as is the case with the other large cities in the UK too. They're way underperforming where they should be and playing a much smaller role in the national economy than should be the case too. And part of the reason why the UK's productivity overall lags behind other Western European countries is because of this underperformance of its biggest cities outside of London. And that's what we need to change. And we'll only see greater regional prosperity if we see these big cities actually playing that role and being the engines that sit at the heart of those wider regional economies. But the second point to make on that, in terms of closing the gap, is that if we do see, big cities playing the role they should be playing, it will very much narrow the gap between the big cities and London. But actually, we shouldn't expect it to close. And certainly the narrative around levelling up, the very term levelling up seems to suggest that we're going to make everywhere the same. And from an economy perspective, actually, that is not the case, or that can't be the case, and that different parts of the country play very different roles. Manchester should be much more productive than smaller towns like Warrington, or certainly much more productive than rural areas like Cumbria, for example. The challenge is that that's not the case currently, that Cumbria and Manchester are fairly equal. But at the same time, if Manchester was performing as best it possibly could, we should also expect London, being the even larger city, should still be the leading light of the UK economy.
And if that's the case, then, that they can tackle the economic dominance of London, why is it that that hasn't happened so far? What's been standing in their way?
Well, we've been trying to do this in various forms for over 90 years now. It was 1928, we think, was the first levelling up style policy that was put in place. So we've had many decades of trying to have a crack at this. I think there were two main reasons for why it hasn't been successful. The first is that policy is focused on trying to prop up what we already have, rather than looking to the future necessarily. So that will be around, supporting failing businesses in the 70s, or trying to boost manufacturing in places, rather than trying to look to the future about what's the next thing that's going to come down the line that we can support, rather than sustain what we already have. And the second thing, I think, particularly over the last 40 years or so, is that there hasn't been that city focus, despite the claims that we do have from certain parts of the conversation. There hasn't been any particular city bias in policy. Actually, see a number of policies over that time that have been very non-urban in their focus. And I don't think we've had enough focus on trying to turn around the challenges that these big cities have faced as they've grappled with deindustrialization and try to get hold of the advantages and the opportunities that a more knowledge-based economy presents itself, particularly to these big places.
Rebecca, can I come to you? How does this look to you in terms of the cities in the West Midlands? How do you think they could challenge London's economic dominance?
And I think because in the West Midlands, how close we are to London means we should have better linkages, especially along company supply chains and so on, and develop those to be much stronger. I think at the moment, cities outside of London are seen as islands far away, and I think that that's something that we need to change and create those more collaborative relationships, and ensure that the working pattern of what we do, it works across the cities completely. And I think what we've learned in the last 18 months actually is that that's much easier to do than we expected with things like online and hybrid working. And I think that change is already beginning to happen. So it's how we build on that and demonstrate that cities can offer as much as London can offer. And that's not just in terms of working base, but also sort of the wider housing, culture, and educational offer that they can offer to people to retain them, as Paul said.
So coming to you, I know you've done some work already looking at how the pandemic has affected the UK's economic geography, but I've been quite struck looking at the numbers on employment rates and use of furlough, that it really did seem to be London that was most affected in terms of the number of jobs that got furloughed during the pandemic. And London still sort of stands out as one of the only of the cities really where employment rates and numbers in employment haven't really caught back up to their pre-pandemic levels. Do you have any thoughts on how is this going to play out? Is this a permanent impact on London's economy?
Yeah, I think it's, the big surprising thing about the impact of the pandemic on London is kind of how marginal the effects have been on kind of London's overall economic activity. So those higher rates of furlough that you mentioned, that will come directly out of London's relative concentration in the hospitality sector, right? And so there's going to be some sort of persistent effects on the hospitality sector until sort of tourism starts to come back in earnest. But the sort of the amazing sort of story of the pandemic and its effect on the UK's economic geography is that just how mild the effect has been on London. So you've got this sort of relatively mild effect on economic activity, which the furlough, was doing its job. It sort of supported that process, okay, in terms of cushioned that process. And then, what you have in the housing market, going on in the housing market, which is sort of the central market for, the economic geography of the UK, is, again, very, very marginal effects, right? So this sort of vaunted move towards remote work, where we thought that would favour sort of more distant locations from the centre, that's happened, but only marginally. So what seems to have happened is that, some people are exercising the opportunity to sort of move a bit further out for more space, right? But that sort of race for space has been a very limited one, right? And it's essentially just moving a bit further out into the suburbs, or a bit further out from London. That doesn't seem to be manifesting itself as a kind of major relocation of activity within England, at least.
Paul or Rebecca, do you have any thoughts or any evidence on how the pandemic has affected the relative attractiveness of different cities?
Well, certainly looking at the anecdotes has been that there's been this race to leave London, but I think what we need to recognise is that this happens all the time. London has been a net loser of people to the rest of England and Wales for many, many years. And the question is then, have we seen an increase in the trend over recent months or recent years, or have we actually just seen a continuing of people sort of delayed from moving because the pandemic hit, and then on the one end, and then we've got people who were going to leave anyway and decided to actually bring that decision a little bit further forward. And I guess time will tell on that. But certainly some information that we saw Rightmove present at an event that we've had actually just earlier today, we saw that of the people who have been leaving London or looking to leave Manchester and other big cities, they don't tend to have moved very far. So the movement patterns that we think we've seen over the last 2 years are actually reflective of the broader trends that we've seen over the last, say, decade, where people are choosing to leave the city, but not necessarily leaving the city labour market because they're still living within commutable distance, which is quite different to some of the predictions about how people could work anywhere. And actually, we're going to see this mass migration, particularly further north, as a result of people being freed from the office.
And I think in terms of that, it's vital that there is that churn, because one of the benefits for cities is that people do go and work in London, gain those skills, gain that experience, and then bring that back. So that's actually a positive churn that's very good to maintain. And I think in terms of the evidence for that movement, certainly in Birmingham, the house prices are very, very buoyant and growing. And that is to some extent driven, we think, by some of that relocation activity happening, but that had already started before the pandemic. And I think the other thing, just to pick up on Paul's point, actually, is that I'd agree with that movement. People tend to move relatively short distances because you still have your world and your environment around you. You still have the schools, you still have family, etc. And I think if there is any sort of large scale movement that we might see, it'll be more about that work-life balance issue of going back to family and friends, etc., rather than and that hybrid working might enable that to happen.
Oh, sorry, no, go for it.
Yeah, what I would add to that is kind of reinforcing sort of what Paul said in particular. So, the movements that we're seeing now are still influenced by the freeze that we went through during the pandemic. So a good example of this is discussion of the Great Resignation, this idea that lots of people are resigning their jobs, right? Now, if you look at the labour market data, what happened during the pandemic was that because of policies like the furlough, because of social distancing, the labour market effectively froze, right? So people resigning, people taking up new jobs, that fell in an unprecedented way. And so a lot of what we're starting to see now is just catch up of people who would have moved their job, 6 months ago or 9 months ago, making that decision, right? So a lot of these things about that you might read about, like the Great Resignation, a race for space, reports of house prices going up massively really quickly, house prices going down massively really quickly. A lot of that is part of the adjustment patterns of the pandemic. and the sort of the trends that Beck and Paul have talked about, that's what I'm seeing in the data as well.
So just quickly before we go to the audience, to play devil's advocate, is our view of the need for more stronger cities in the UK a bit skewed by our perspective from a tiny island? The UK geographically is only a little over half the size of California, and I don't know if we'd be debating why there are so few large cities in Southern California. Is there merit in that? Is it okay that the UK just has one dominant city?
It's a great question. I think the California is at one end of the example. If we take another example at the other end of the scale, if you look at the Rhine-Ruhr area of Germany and the Randstad area of Holland, a number of successful cities within both those areas, and actually, given that they're not geographically too far apart, actually all of those cities sort of are in relative competition with each other as well, and probably over a space which is not dissimilar to maybe the size of England at the very least, if not the UK. So I definitely think it is possible. And I think if we certainly look at the literature and the theory, would suggest that concentrating lots of activity in one place and all the benefits that then brings means that cities, and particularly large cities, should perform in a certain way. So is there an impact of having Manchester and Leeds so close together? Perhaps. I think it's hard to prove that either way. But should we also be expecting Manchester and Leeds to be performing much better than they currently are, irrespective of their relative locations? And say definitely they're well behind where we should expect them to be.
Thanks very much. So questions from the audience coming in then. The first question is, the government has talked about moving 22,000 civil service jobs out of London as part of its levelling up agenda. What do you think of that proposal? Is that going to do much to help boost the regional economic performance? Rebecca, I'll come to you first.
I mean, I think with that one, it's quite an interesting one, because this has been talked about before and tried before. What I do think it does is it starts to create a denser labour market and opportunity within places, because you get more skilled people, and it brings higher paid jobs, and that in itself creates, exactly as Paul mentioned, around the agglomeration of dense labour markets. That means that businesses will benefit from that if those people move around. I think the main problem with it, though, is if it's sort of piecemeal, and actually we've yet to see whether those people will actually move. So I think that it's sort of one to watch. And of course, in the West Midlands, we've benefited from the levelling up department moving into Wolverhampton, for instance, which makes a big difference to a city centre that has been hard hit by the pandemic.
Paul or Mirko, do you have any extra thoughts?
Yeah. So I'll probably talk about this a bit later, but yeah, I definitely kind of agree with Beck's analysis, and I would actually go further. So I think, this policy of kind of moving civil servants around the country, it's potentially a really, really good idea. It can potentially have a lot of big benefits for particular areas, but it works on the principle of building dense labour markets, right? And building these dense, thick labour markets such that people can move between different types of jobs, right? And the big problem with what the strategy the government is taking is that it's kind of doing this in lots of different places, right? So a big reason why London is successful is that it's got an incredibly dense globalized labour market, right? For many industries, London is the only, or is just so dominant in terms of building your career, right? And what I see as the problem with what the government is doing is it's putting the ONS in Newport, it's going to put the Treasury in Darlington, it's putting the BBC in Manchester, it's putting Channel 4 in Leeds, it puts Doctor Who in Cardiff, right? It's spreading out all of these opportunities to build a dense, high-skilled labour market in a smaller number of places, right? And so that's how I would think about modifying that policy, right? And it means that sort of, some cities lose out initially, right? But there would be really big benefits for building some major kind of clusters of dense, high-skilled labour markets outside of London.
Yeah, just briefly to add to that as well, to agree with everything that's been said. Also, these moves are pretty high profile, but their economic impact is pretty small. And really what policy should be thinking about is not moving a couple of hundred jobs around the country into the different pockets that they get put into, but actually thinking about how do you set the conditions to create many tens of thousands of private sector jobs. And that's ultimately how you're going to see a shift in the performance of these places.
Great, thank you. So to move on to our second question then, Mirko, I'll come to you first on this one. Is it better, if we want to tackle regional inequality, to invest in towns or in cities?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. So I get the sense that I agree with my other panelists too much, and that that's not the fashion of current debate, that you need to get angry. So I'll kind of restate what I've said, but in a kind of more forceful way. So in terms of like investing, towns versus cities, I strongly make the case that we want to invest in cities, and kind of at the upper end of the big cities outside of London. What's happened during the pandemic, it's reinforced my view. When you look at the trends of what's been occurring since the 2000s, so in around 2006, kind of median London house prices were 60% above, Manchester or Birmingham prices. By 2019, they were 120% above Manchester or Birmingham prices. So, there was this major process of kind of globalization, concentration of high-skilled workers, gentrification that occurred in London during the 2010s, right? We thought that the pandemic might do something to dent that, but it barely dented it, right? And that's because of, underpinning all of the discussions and the argument that we three panelists seem to have arrived at fairly independently is agglomeration, right? So, like London house prices and other kind of economic magnitudes in London, they increased because of these really strong agglomeration economies, right? So this is just the idea that high-skilled jobs and, the high-skilled jobs and industries already in London were a magnet for further high-skilled jobs and industries. So in terms of kind of leveling up and in terms of these investment strategies, as we were talking about before, I think it would make, we should consider this idea of placing bigger bets on fewer places, like put both the BBC and Channel 4, in a single location, in a single major city, try and build a big, dense labor market in that industry, in that city, right? So the big goal here is, to exploit agglomeration economies. I kind of see this, the big problem with what's going on is that policy discussion tends to take place in a zero-sum context, right? If one town gets a particular prize in terms of the location of some sort of government-sponsored activity, then another place doesn't get it. What we need to have is a sense of the benefits of agglomeration and like a two-phase policy towards reducing spatial inequality, right? So, a big successful labour market in a place like Manchester or Birmingham is going to benefit the Northwest, is going to benefit the West Midlands, right? And the crucial thing that I think needs to be achieved as part of the levelling up debate is to get away from the two things, like understand the economics of spatial inequality in the UK, and the economics are underpinned by the concept of agglomeration, right? Like stuff attracts other stuff, right? So that's the first thing we've got to understand, is get that understanding of agglomeration. The second thing is to sort of avoid zero-sum thinking, right? And that's, part of the political process, the expediency of the political process. I don't know how exactly we can subvert that, but it's got to start with an understanding of the basic economics of the situation.
Do you agree with that? Mirko was sort of suggesting there that the government needs to focus its attentions on specific areas rather than scattergunning investments across the country. Do you agree with that? How should the government go about deciding where gets the investment?
So was that for Beck or for me, Gemma?
That was for you, Paul.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, right. Yeah, so I'd agree with everything that's just been said there, but of course there's a political challenge here, which is the government was elected in on the back of well, allegedly, although actually the data doesn't necessarily back this up, about voters in red wall towns. So what does it then do? And I think what we have to then do is actually sort of think about, from the levelling up agenda, that we're trying to do two separate things. One is about trying to boost the performance of our bigger cities because of all that agglomeration argument. And the second one is about trying to improve standards of living. And there isn't any particular geography to that. We should just be trying to do that in places where we are lagging behind. But it is that link between town and city that is really, really important in this. That when we have, the argument is it's pit cities v towns, is very, very unhelpful because it misses that link. And so what we see is, firstly, in the research that we've done, not all towns perform poorly. The narrative seems to suggest that that's the case. We must remember that there are many strongly performing towns. The second point is that of those successful towns, the majority of them tend to be close to successful performing cities. And so the link there between town and city is important, both in terms of access to jobs, but actually it seems it has some influence in terms of the investment that the town gets itself from the private sector. And so then trying to boost the performance of that big city is a really important part of trying to bring greater prosperity to towns where they're struggling. And I think looking at an example of this, a counterexample, is very illustrative. So if we look at Birmingham, which Beck obviously knows very, very well, Birmingham is, underperforming. It doesn't perform as well as relative to the national average, never mind compared to its European peers. And yet, of the 9 towns that we see around Birmingham, 2 of them perform well. So the question is, well, how can that be? Birmingham doesn't perform very well, or where it should be, where these 2 towns, Cannock and Lichfield, do very well. But what's going on is that despite Birmingham's underperformance, it's still home to many hundreds of thousands of high-skilled jobs, because it's a big place. There should be many more high-skilled jobs than what there are, but there's still lots there. Then those people who are deciding to live outside of Birmingham but commuting in have then got a choice about where they're going to go. A lot of them choose to go into villages in Warwickshire or Staffordshire or Worcestershire. But of those who decide to go to a town, they've got a choice of 9 places to go to. And they go to Lichfield or Cannock. Why is that? Seems like quality of life is better in those places, or standards of living, shall I say. So housing quality is better and crime is lower as 2 measures of that. Now, the issue for then, say, Kidderminster or Bromsgrove could be, well, why don't we just improve housing quality and try and reduce crime? Those themselves are very noble policy goals, and we probably should be trying to do them. But if we do them on their own, without increasing the size of the prosperity pie that's generated within Birmingham, all we're doing is literally trying to reshuffle people from town to town around Birmingham. And so while that might be a better outcome for Bromsgrove, it's actually not a better outcome for a Lichfield or a Cannock. And so the answer has to be, not the whole answer, it has to be in part about trying to improve the economic performance of Birmingham. And then you make your series of investments, which the government seems to be calling social infrastructure, investments in social infrastructure in those places around skills, around life, sort of health, around performance of schools, around softer things, around investment in football pitches, or whatever it is the government decides to do to try and impact that element of standards of living.
And Rebecca, Paul's already talked quite detailedly about the West Midlands geography, but
I suppose actually, I and this builds on what Paul's just said. Actually, is that I don't like the question. And I think there's a problem at the moment with the whole approach to investment in places, is that it's a competitive process. And this whole idea of pitting towns against cities is problematic, because as Paul's just illustrated, the reality is all these places are interconnected and they create an ecosystem. I mean, in the West Midlands, we actually have 3 cities that are very close. And they have distinct purposes and they have distinct economies, and that's that ecosystem, as Paul's just described, about where people live, where people travel to, where they come for entertainment, is vital. And I think it's important that places understand that interaction, and investment should be made so that it has that spillover effect into other places. But the language of competition is a problem, and it means that partnership doesn't bloom really in that circumstance.
And let me come to you, Rebecca, with a specific question that's coming from the audience, from Mike from Birmingham, who asks what should be done about the big difference between major cities and peripheral towns like Walsall, Wakefield, and Rochdale.
I mean, I think there's again, what should be done is problematic language in the sense of, really, places should be able to flourish and grow and invest in the assets that they have. And this is sort of veering into the next question a little bit, but in order to understand that and drive that, there needs to be investment in skills and capacity and capability to grow places, and so that they can benefit from one another. And that's that's something that we have to invest in, so that Walsall can actually benefit from that growth that we've just been talking about in Birmingham. What does it mean for their housing market? What does it mean for the expanding city centre and the expanding city of Birmingham, which is happening, and how can they benefit from that? So closer working relationships is key to that, and planning within that, and how you plan together.
And Paul, perhaps you can answer another question that's come in from the audience. Someone has asked, does a future regional strategy need to consider alternative industries so that regional cities aren't competing with London? Does the government need to kind of decide that, I don't know, Birmingham's going to do this and Manchester will do that?
But the nature of that question suggests that the government has got all these powers to be able to say, right, we're going to put the industry X here and industry X there. I'm sure there are many politicians that, and certainly have been over the years, that have thought they have that great power. But the reality is the state just doesn't have those sorts of levers to pull. In the same way, the state doesn't have the ability to push lots of high-skilled jobs into fairly small places. And that's why the focus on big cities in particular is important, because you're actually working with the grain of in principle where high-skilled jobs would go. The more successful cities are the ones that have a whole range of different industries in them. If you look at London, for example, it's law, it's software development, it's finance, it's all these different things. And actually then they come together to some extent and interact with one another. And that sort of creates new activity and pushes on new activity. I think the thing we need to do for anywhere in the country, but particularly the big cities, is not to probably obsess about individual sectors, but is to say, we know what's driving growth today, but we don't know what's driving growth in 10 years or 20 years' time. Well, we're going to have a fairly good idea that's going to be knowledge-based. So it's going to require access to skilled workers, principally, before anything else. It's going to prefer density, probably. So a city centre location is likely to be a popular choice for these types of businesses. And then you need to be trying to get those workers to those locations, which then tells you something about local transport. And I think cities that are able to provide those things, to then create a crucible for growth for these new industries as they come about, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, that's the key to success, rather than necessarily trying to direct sectors in certain directions.
So with that, we'll move on to our final question, which I'll come to you first on, Rebecca. I have a feeling I may know the gist of your answer to this, but what's your feeling about whether more regional independence is needed to help strengthen our cities?
I think the answer from my point of view is actually yes, there needs to be greater independence, but with that needs to come powers and ability to act. One of the things that we've looked at quite a lot in the West Midlands, and through WM Ready, we did some work for the Industrial Strategy Council, which highlighted that there isn't really an optimal scale for devolution. And that's partly because of all the things that we've just been discussing, actually. And that therefore the development should be evolutionary. And it's a process, not an event, which means building on current structures, capacity and capabilities. And I think the problem is greater independence does mean greater ability to invest, to act, and to make decisions at a local level, where those decisions make a real difference, and the people at the local level can understand what's best. And all the things that we've just been talking about in terms of the relationship with towns and cities, it's people that live in those towns and cities that understand that, and they need to be able to be empowered to make those decisions. But I think one of the things that we have done and been involved in terms of research as well was that places actually don't have this capacity and capability. So we've seen it in the last few rounds of investment, which again, in terms of competitive processes, it doesn't create that collaboration as much as it could do, and it actually creates greater divides. But that capacity and capability to create good strategy and develop partnerships and bids to attract funding is vital for places. So again, thinking about that, the government offices come into local places, they get a better understanding of that place. So it creates that knowledge. And it also means that you've got people that are experienced in doing these things into places, which then can help the local institutions as well.
I mean, it's really interesting. Just to sort of dig into that a bit more, what are the sorts of decisions that you think you're well placed to make in the West Midlands, either because it's something where greater local insight helps, or because you have the existing capabilities to do that?
I think understanding what the assets are of a place, understanding both public-private assets, and understanding the capability of the place. So, what sort of sectors are strong? What the risks are with those sectors? We have, we're obviously well known for the automotive sector, which has gone through a lot of change, especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic. But we're also facing the greening of the automotive sector, and also the Brexit supply chain issues. So those are sorts of things that we know very well and very intimately, because we have good relationships with businesses, and we have good relationships with the sort of the research and the R&D assets in the region that understand what needs to be done and delivered. And we can end up actually, and this is one of the problems that we have in terms of investment. We can end up with a patchwork quilt of investment, because you win what you win, and you lose what you lose. And the things that you lose might be vital to a supply chain. They might be vital to a particular area, and that then causes problems in terms of developing the economy, because all of a sudden, you're delivering the funding that you've won, and other things might not get funded. And that's one of the problems with this competitive environment. And I think there's something around in terms of the levelling up agenda. If we're serious about restoring civic pride, then actually you have to give places the ability to act and make that change locally, and also strengthen the ability to do good partnership working. And I think with the with the pandemic experience, we've showed, and we've again done research in this in the West Midlands and in the North East actually, about bringing together these partners to develop action, where they've got shared goals, they're tackling big problems. This has really worked well in the pandemic, and it needs to be capitalised and invested in. Otherwise, places will continue to struggle.
So you were talking there about the competitive environment. I suppose for the benefit of viewers who aren't deeply immersed in this area, I think you're referring there to the fact that many of the pots of money that have been made available for levelling up have been structured in such a way that local areas have to put in a bid to central government, which is then assessed, and the money comes sort of ring fence for that specific project, as opposed to local areas having more freedom to decide how to spend the money. Obviously, the advantage of that is that it ensures that spending is directly aligned with the priorities of the UK government elected by the UK people, and that you prioritise money on the highest value projects all across the country. How do you sort of balance those two challenges? How do you have both make the most of local knowledge and independence at the same time as ensuring that you have a kind of coherent set of policies across the country?
The first of my immediate response to that is, it's important that government actually knows what it wants from this funding and communicates it well, regardless of what the mechanism is for allocating it. And I think that's an important part of ensuring that the national objectives actually are delivered at the local level. But we've had devolved budgets before, which worked along those lines, and RDA's had considerable budgets to do that sort of activity. And although the high level policy agenda was set at the national level, you had the skills and capability to do that delivery and decision making around prioritisation at the local level, and it worked relatively well. We also have democratic processes that ensure that we're meeting the needs of local people, and that's sometimes it's where that democratic decision is made. Is it at the local level or is it at the national level? So I think there are an awful lot of things around that process. But I think that from my point of view, I think the cons of competitive processes outweigh the benefits of getting places to work together to address a lot of the issues that we highlighted about effective agglomeration, effective housing markets, effective transport areas.
Well,
And that's coming on that as well, Gemma. Yeah. So there's an element to this, which is there's some of this stuff that it's not in the business of central government, but I think the way that we've had government structured in the UK for many decades is that central government now thinks it is its problem. In Germany, that wouldn't be the case for sure, certainly at the state level at the very least, if not at some of the more local levels as well. And in France, that would be the case to some extent too. So some of this is down to local, or should be down to local authorities to deliver. And then hopefully you're seeing an improvement in policy and outcomes because you're actually tailoring policy to the needs that place requires, rather than just one size fits all type thing. I hate using that phrase now because I've said it so many times over the years, but I guess it's true. One size fits all policy coming out of Whitehall that isn't really tailored to anywhere. Now, that isn't to say that then there's central government is then completely absolved of everything. Clearly, I think there should be an overarching strategy, and there are going to be for starters. Then the second thing is that some of the investments required are going to be too large for local government to do on their own. So there's then going to require investment from the state to do that. But there are other elements where actually it should be devolved, and it's up to the local areas to do it. Now, there's one area where the national government probably could retain some control over, and that would be about the allocation of money to these two different areas. So what we would like to see is, I don't know, a 4 or 5 year settlement done, with every local authority, although we would reduce the number of local authorities to make that simpler. And then they're able to spend that money on whatever they want over a 5 year period. But of course, at the negotiation stage, the government can then decide however much money it's going to give to those local areas. And then you would alter that according to the role that different parts of the country are playing in the national economy. And so from an economy perspective, a Greater Manchester or a West Midlands body would get more money to do with the economy than, say, a Cumbria or a West Cumbria body.
Are there particular policy areas where the evidence is strongest that having local control really delivers the strongest benefits, and any policy areas that are better handled at a national level?
I think the evidence is probably fairly patchy. The OECD have done some work recently, suggests that is the case. That's probably the most developed I've seen of this. But of course, this thing is very difficult to prove, isn't it? But at the same time, if we flip the question around and say, is there any evidence that having everything centralised within a central government department is the best way to do it? The answer to that is probably no as well. And so it's interesting to have the reflection. I think it's sort of a similar argument comes up about capacity. And while I think there are steps we do need to take to build capacity at the local level, which comes back to what I was just saying there about merging local authorities and trying to make more of the resources that they have. So the doubts that Whitehall tends to have around local authorities around capacity seems to suggest that central government gets it right every time. And we've only got an hour, so we can't run through all the examples of where that's not the case. So it is always worth bearing that counter view in mind.
And we're talking quite generally here about independence. What's really important here, is it that local leaders have a pot of money and they can make decisions about how to spend that, or is it also important to have tax setting powers at a local level? And what's the sort of structure locally that's important? Is it important to have a big figurehead in a local area to drive this, or is that not an important part of this? Happy, whoever would like to take that one. Paul, you nodding your head.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolise the conversation, but we've done quite a lot of work on this, so I'll be brief and let colleagues come in as well. Apologies. So having a directly elected mayor to us seems to be pretty important. So it's that one person who's elected by the whole of the electorate rather than one neighbourhood of one part of the city, which is how local authority leaders are currently elected. And that gives somebody who's got a mandate then, I think, to go about doing the things that he or she then needs to do because of that electoral backing that they then get at the ballot box. So having that visibility, I think, is really important. Particularly, I think we would have that within cities. I think we'd have that in non-urban areas as well. Whether you'd call them a mayor or a sheriff or whatever, I think we're probably fairly relaxed about that. The tax devolution question is the one that I think as a community we continue to dance around and not really sort of nail. But to some extent, actually, I don't think it's the one that we need to tackle straight away, because there's the first step before that we do need to address, which is that central government, certainly since the Thatcher government, but perhaps even earlier, has put local authorities in a financial straitjacket. So they get their budgets on a 1 year basis. They have to balance the books each year, so you can't borrow or invest. If you raise money from car parks, let's say, you have to spend it on transport, and you can't go and spend it in different areas, which hugely constrains what local authorities can actually do with the money that they've got. And I think there's a pretty cost-free policy that we can do here, which is to remove that financial straitjacket, to give them a 5-year budget, let's say, which, as you were saying, Gemma, they can spend how they want. And then all of a sudden that hopefully gives them much greater freedom to direct the money that they have into the areas that are the biggest challenge. The conversation about fiscal devolution can then come after that, but it feels like there's an argument we need to win before then, before we jump to that fiscal devolution conversation, which we seem to keep on doing.
So, Gemma, if I can sort of, my perspective on this is sort of, it's similar to Paul, but it's just much more abstract, right? In terms of what I see going on with sort of regional policy is what I see going on with lots of different areas of policy, like COVID policy, pandemic policy, for example. And it's this sort of tendency for decision makers to really micromanage processes and look at not very well defined links between actions and outcomes, right? But this kind of micromanaging, which leads to sort of fostering a competitive zero-sum environment, which just leads to a lot of confusion in policy making, right? So I see the two things that you want to do here, or like the big thing central government needs to do is sort of set some basic important principles to how it's going to reduce spatial inequality in the UK, right? And so a good heuristic principle that I think they should think about sort of adopting more prominently would be sort of like what Paul suggested towards the start of our conversation, which is, you have some sort of sense of a priority on the biggest city in a particular region, right? And this idea that you're going to build up agglomeration within a region based on a big city. So it'd be kind of Manchester for the Northwest, Birmingham for the North Midlands, and so on. So the big thing that central government can do is set up those principles. And that principle would be really important for getting away from this competitive zero-sum environment, right? And then the second thing you want to do, speaking abstractly as an economist, is align incentives, right? And that's where, in abstract terms, that's where the issue of regional independence comes in, right? So the basic idea that we've been discussing here is that, it's the local mayors who have got most of the information about the area, and they've got the most direct interest or stake in the area, right? And, if we're going to think about regional independence and sort of devolution of responsibilities, we've got to think about why we're doing that, right? And if we start to think about this in the context of aligning incentives, we're more likely to think about the right mechanisms and implement the right policies, rather than throw lots of things up against the wall, right? So I see the fundamental thing that's kind of lacking in current government policy is that sort of the basic settings, like the overall settings. And without those overall settings, you just get into this whirlpool of micromanagement and just repeating the phrase red wall all the time. Okay.
Thank you. Actually, your point there links nicely to a question that's come in from the audience from Bruce, who asks, would it be better to provide investment pots to local decision makers, but to give them stretching cross-regional improvement, so targets clear outcome objectives that they're expected to achieve with the money that's given to them, and then holding them to account on that? Rebecca, how would you feel about that?
Well, I think that would be a very positive way forward, as just highlighted. Government has actually published outcome indicators recently with the Treasury announcements. So there is some sort of basic sort of understanding of doing that by department. I think the problem at the moment is how that lands and how you work with it at the local level, especially if there isn't the data to measure those outcomes, and that is one of the problems, and it's a problem with sort of inequality. We've just had the review of the inequality statistics and so on, and it's very difficult to understand inequality at a very local level, and therefore set outcomes that tackle it, because the data and the research and the evidence isn't there. So I think in principle, yes, I agree completely with that. And as the Green Book review showed, just picking up on the last comment actually, that a lot of business cases struggle with the strategic outline and focus, and then what that means in terms of outcomes and outputs, and that's a big issue both in central government and in local government, and then translating that into the local level. Central government departments do actually have to do an assessment of impacts locally, and the more that that happens, the better in terms of those outcomes and outputs. And if we can get it right at the local level as well, then that can only add to the impact as just been mentioned.
Mirko or Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I actually I disagree now. We've got disagreement. Or well, in terms of like kind of what Bruce originally asked. So I think a fundamental problem with how we see like public sector driven policy is this, again, excessive micromanagement, trying to see links between actions and outcomes when it's kind of very difficult to see those links. I think there's a lot that we can learn from how kind of venture capital works, right? So I've been doing some research on venture capital. What you see there is that kind of success rates are very low, returns are very skewed, right? So your average venture capitalist is basically kind of experimenting with lots of different investments, lots of different policies, and they tend to get their returns from a few big wins, right? And that's just part of the inherent process of the market and the process of experimentation, right? And I think a big problem with the political economy of government interventions is that we're harder on government interventions and the success or failure of government interventions, and there's a greater kind of penalty or punishment for a politician or a bureaucratic policymaker for a perceived failure of a policy. And we've got to make these investments on the basis of some stuff is going to succeed, but a lot of stuff is going to fail, right? And that's why that sort of reinforces the importance of sort of concentrating your bets a bit more, right? Because if you have a bunch of successes and failures, if you get those successes in one place, you're going to have this multiplier effect, right? So you might have kind of 10 projects in a particular area, at least two of them succeed and they feed off of each other, right? So I think, in terms of how we approach policy, we need to kind of step back a bit in terms of this kind of, again, overall micromanagement, right? And actually, this is, the spirit that we need to learn from the private sector, as opposed to sort of the idea of deregulating labor markets, right? Or deregulating labor and product markets. What we really need to learn from the private sector and the market is the notion of experimentation, the notion of kind of, a set of successes and failures.
We are unfortunately now drawing to the end of our session, and we've talked about a lot of different types of interventions and approaches here. So I want to give you all a chance before we wrap up to pick what's the one policy change that you would make to improve regional inequality. Paul, I'll come to you first.
So if it's one thing and nothing else that, say, Levelling Up should do, it should be about trying to improve skills outcomes. So for us, that would be increase the amount of money spent on skills, the share of GDP, creating a number of different policies designed to try and both improve the quality of provision in further education in particular, but also take up in further education, and then trying to improve school outcomes as well. If we do nothing else, skills are the biggest predictor of why places perform the way they do across the country. So I would put my money on that.
Mirko, what would be your pick?
I would say there's two phases for the policy of levelling up. In phase one, you want bigger bets on fewer places and you want to tap into agglomeration. Phase two, the towns, the rest of the country will follow. But it's like bigger bets. It's two phases: agglomeration, bigger bets in fewer places.
Rebecca?
Well, it builds on Paul's actually. So if I was going to invest in anything to tackle inequality, it would be early years and family interventions, which gives you a much better longer term return. And also in terms of we're about to publish some work on income inequality that's been done in the CA, which looks at this, builds on what Paul's just said, actually looks at the fact that your destiny to some extent is set quite early on by the opportunities and skills and networks that you build when you're young, and those very small differentials of income at an early age get bigger and bigger as you get older. So that early years skills and investment in effectively the family to develop those opportunities in the future is vital, really, to create leveling up. It's the advice we give to developing countries. Maybe we should do it ourselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for contributing to really interesting discussion, and thank you to everyone who's been watching and sending in questions. Please do take a look at the new Cage policy report that's out now and touches on some of these issues as well. And also don't miss the next Cage event, in which Professor Nicholas Crafts and journalist Duncan Weldon will discuss COVID recovery, what can we learn from post-World War II economic history. And that's on November the 24th at 12 o'clock, again drawing on new research from the Cage policy report. And you can sign up on the Cage website. Thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to doing something again soon.
Thank you.